The Ideological Basis for Sectional Cultures, Chapter 3 of The Rise and Fall of the Plantation South by Raimondo Luraghi. The so-called Pilgrim Fathers did not land in Virginia, and this was not by chance. To speculate on what might have happened had they landed at Jamestown is purely a waste of time. History went as it went, and not as it might have gone. At any rate, the Pilgrims settled in Massachusetts. Objectively, they were a very mixed array. They did not even know they were the Pilgrim Fathers. The name was given to them by 19th century historians. However, the transcendental importance of Plymouth's settlement was that it opened the way for the great Puritan wave that followed several years later. Let us not be concerned for the time being with the economic base of the Puritan oligarchy. It has been said and re-said that the Puritans were a bourgeois vanguard, that their social base was bourgeois capitalist, and this is undoubtedly true, but this truth requires some qualification. As it has been correctly observed, without a careful analysis of the legal, moral, religious, and institutional inheritance and its survivals in colonial life, it is impossible to understand the peculiar story of any social formation. The economic and ecologic processes enable us to account for the room given that inheritance to breathe. What needs to be stressed here is the singular philosophy and Weltanschauung that the Puritans brought with them. Puritanism was historically akin to Calvinism, and Calvinism had its deepest foundations in the doctrines of St. Augustine, as set out in such works as The City of God. During his youth, St. Augustine had been a faithful adherent of Manichaeanism. Later, under the influence of Greek philosophy and Roman Catholicism, he became a Christian. However, the Manichaean division of mankind into sons of light and sons of darkness was to reemerge dramatically in his thought when, in his mature age, he was fighting his great ideological battle against Pelagius, bishop of the Gauls. Pelagius's doctrine, considering human nature to be healthy and free from the consequences of original sin, postulated that man's will was totally free and able to bring mankind to eternal salvation by itself. This conclusion was not surprising, as Pelagius was a follower of Greek philosophy, mainly Stoicism. St. Augustine believed such ideas to be wrong, because, for one thing, by giving an excessive power and autonomy to human reason, Pelagius would have ended by considering useless both the Church and the coming of Christ as instruments of human redemption. Pushed by an urge to give what seemed to him the deepest meaning to a sacrifice of Christ, St. Augustine moved backward, burning more and more what he had worshipped, and turned toward a doctrine of human predestination that was all but loathsome to the classical spirit. The classical cultures of Greece and Rome had considered man to be the center of the universe and had underlined his total intellectual freedom, with some exception, however, in early Stoicism, founding such freedom on the rational nature of man. To St. Augustine, men seemed more and more subservient to sin and doomed to damnation, except for an elite group who were granted the grace of God, through a totally arbitrary choice by the Almighty. Classical culture, which St. Augustine had once relied on to build up his doctrine of intellectual freedom, became, in his mind, the paraphernalia of the city of the devil. The philosopher, A. Weber wrote of him, had bestowed respectfully to classical virtues. The theologian could no more see in them any other thing than concealed sins, splendida vitia. The Catholic Church had early been aware of the potential dangers that were inherent in St. Augustine's doctrine. The major Catholic philosopher and theologian of the later Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas, spent so much of his dialectic ability in clarifying and explaining what St. Augustine had really meant that the phrase Augustinus eget Thoma interprete became familiar. Afraid of seeing a doctrine of predestination creep into Catholicism through St. Augustine's ideas, St. Thomas maintained that, certainly, Pelagius was wrong. No man may achieve redemption without grace, but grace is not distributed on an arbitrary basis, for God himself, being pure and supreme reason, cannot do anything irrational or illogical. That this simply would shift determinism from human to divine reason can be sustained. However, St. Thomas's doctrine succeeded in preventing the Catholic Church from accepting a doctrine of predestination, which would have broken any link with classical tradition and culture. The Reformation was to reject St. Thomas's philosophy and return to St. Augustine's as more congenial. In his old age, St. Augustine had moved dangerously close to the Manichaeanism of his youth, although without relapsing into it. In the latter Middle Ages, a Protean heresy had appeared throughout Europe, Catharism. The ubiquitous Catharist groups preached predestination and a sharp distinction of mankind into saints and sinners. The saints, obviously, were the Catharists themselves. The Catholic Church quickly identified Catharists as Manichaeists, but only recently has it been possible to find in the records of the Middle Ages a clear, explicit allusion to Mani by Catharists. The contributions of Catharism are almost impossible to measure, but it was certainly an important influence on the characteristics of such heretical sects of the Middle Ages as Albigensianism, Vaudois, Lollardy, and others. The followers of such groups usually entered Calvinist churches, to which they brought a strong Catharistic tendency. This encouraged in Calvinism a fully Manichaean interpretation of St. Augustine's thought, through which the old doctrine of the division of mankind into sons of light and sons of darkness had a revival at the very brink of the modern era. This was a doctrine that repudiated all that was classical and Roman, and also, as a matter of fact, the classicism of the Renaissance. So it was that Calvinism remained watertight to the influence of Renaissance classicism. Certainly, the author of the Institutio Religionis Christianae paid lip service to classicism. He was, after all, a son of his age, but he strongly denied any value whatsoever to pagan ethics. Ulrich Zwingli, who did not want to give up his humanist learning, tried to frame a doctrine of spiritual predestination to salvation so that the major poets and philosophers of Greece and Rome might be included, together with Hebrews and Christians, among the saints, or at least the likely to be sanctified. But Calvin abruptly dismissed such fanciful ideas. Indeed, he rejected more strongly than St. Augustine any reliance on classical culture, and to find the very foundations of his new Civitas Dei, he turned from the New Testament to the ancient one. In doing so, he put completely aside 10 centuries of classical civilization. This kind of suspicion and scorn of classicism permeated English Puritanism from its very beginnings, inasmuch as the hated establishment high church was as prone as Roman Catholicism to Roman tradition, and as ready to swallow the bait of classical culture. The basic ideological differences between Virginia and New England reflected this pattern. The former had been generated as the legitimate daughter of English Renaissance culture. The latter was anti-classic. To it, indeed, classicism and studia humanitatis always were, and had to be, splendida vitia, to be anathematized. So it was that both classical culture and ethics, which had been present at the very birth of Virginia, did not cross the ocean on Pilgrim and Puritan ships. True sons of the Renaissance, the early Virginians read the classics for pleasure and to understand the past and present, whereas their New England counterparts were only reading and printing Bibles. After all, might two civilizations have so distant and different fathers as Sir Walter Raleigh and John Calvin? The Renaissance had to wait for 2 centuries more before entering New England. The great literary wave that traveled all over that country during the first half of the 19th century was appropriately named a Renaissance. It was truly a late coming stepdaughter of the Great Era. But, strange to say, when the Renaissance at last reached New England, it did so in peculiar garb, similar to old puritanical intolerance, but disguised as a classical robe. When the Puritans came to America in the 17th century, the old struggle between saints and demons was simply transported across the Atlantic. However, for the time being, the saints had their hands full. Their thirst for demons to fight against was more than satisfied by French papists and devilish Indians, as well as their own witches. Seen from the distance of time, it is clear that the ideology upon which New England was built was, at any rate, the absolute reverse of the ideology of Virginia. This may seem, and certainly in part is, an oversimplification. However, it gives, I suppose, a fair idea of the opposite ideologies that underlay the sectional conflict of America. Certainly, the development of New England's colonies was distinctly different from the Southern experience. New England was fast becoming a land of thrifty merchants, shipmasters, and bankers, inspired by the idea of a divine mission, accustomed to humbling themselves before an overpowering God, but in the meantime often terribly arrogant, as is usual with righteous men, whose arrogance goes hand in hand with humility. In the South, Renaissance gentlemen believed in a strong individuality and defied adverse fortune by personal virtue. Habitual seigneurs of large landholdings, without any strong religious discipline, they were fond of good reading, leisure, hunting, and horsemanship. With almost no banking, scarce shipping, and no capitalist faith in predestination, there was little trade outside the selling of their tobacco crops. Certainly, such gentlemen had been, at the beginning, mainly men of the lower class. The idea of a Virginia populated by noblemen is a legend. However, Virginia colonists were moving in a cultural atmosphere that gave them such conditioning. These lower class men who first came to the Virginia shore were like seeds sown over a land deeply enriched by classical Renaissance culture. Virginia was the hothouse where such a seigneurial caste was to grow. While the society in New England was insulated, that of the South was not. The South, as well as other American colonies founded by Spain, Portugal, and France, was socially a scion of the seigneurial class of Europe. Ideologically, it was a scion of the Italian Renaissance, and as England was under the spell of such culture more than Spain or Portugal, this was truer of English southern colonies than of Latin American colonies, not forgetting, however, the wide dissemination of Erasmian doctrines throughout New Spain. The peculiar religious incredulity of Renaissance Italy was certainly not widely seen in the American colonies. Latitudinarianism, however, prevailed more often than not. As a matter of fact, the only examples of states founded on religious intolerance were in New England, with the partial exception of Rhode Island, the only colonies where Italian classicism was consciously refused. Certainly, New England's priests and saints were frequently good Latinists, but this must not mislead us. In that era, anybody with any pretensions to even a simple cultural background read Latin. Howard Mumford Jones seems right when he writes, quoting Shakespeare's The Tempest, "It is virtually impossible to imagine a New England Puritan exclaiming, 'Oh wonder! How many goodly creatures are there here! How beauteous mankind is! Oh brave new world that has such people in it!'" The New England mind simply did not work that way. Its new world was for the saints, not for lovers, and it failed to find most of mankind beauteous. So it was also as far as the fine arts were concerned. The violent Puritan rejection of images all but denied the enjoyment of the splendid semi-pagan paintings of the Catholic world, which were, instead, always appreciated in Virginia and the South. Very soon, the textbooks on which New England and Virginia based the intellectual education of their sons came to a sharp division. If the Bible was read in both parts of burgeoning British North America, one should never forget that the book was usually looked at by Puritans through the lens of Calvin's Institutio and St. Augustine's De Civitate Dei, while the fast developing new Virginia gentry looked at the Bible from the standpoint of Baldassare Castiglione's Il Cortegiano and Machiavelli's Il Principe. The ideals of Canadian gentilshommes, of Virginia gentlemen, of New Spain's conquistadores were shaped by Machiavelli for the heroic code and by Castiglione for the gentlemanly perspective. There existed a sharp difference between ideological frames of reference. Ideologies, however, are based on a social and economic structure. In New England, the structure was formed by the rising bourgeoisie. There is certainly a deep meaning in the Puritan rejection of absolutistic, seigneurial England, as well as in the sense of continuity with the philosophy of the mother country that was felt by the Virginians. The old seigneurial system had its continuance in the New World through the South, New France, New Spain, and Brazil, while New England had been founded on the radical rejection of such a system.